You're all welcome to this wonderful August occasion. As you all know, my dear friend and brother and colleague, Salah Hassan, was awarded the CAA Distinguished Scholar Award for 2021. This is a tremendous recognition of the incredible work that he has done as a scholar. And so here we are gathered today to celebrate this fact, but also to navigate around and through what I believe is an incredible, very influential career that Salah has led and will continue to see unfold. So today we are gathered, two of his closest associates and former students who have themselves charted important paths as scholars in their own fields of endeavor. To lead us through this program, I would introduce Iftikhar Dadi and Elizabeth Giorgis briefly. Iftikhar is associate professor at Cornell University in the Department of Art History and Visual Studies. He's an artist in his own right. He is an independent curator with several credits for his exhibition projects, and that has included Lines of Control at the Herbert Johnson Museum at Cornell in 2012. He co-curated Unparking Europe at the Museum Boijmans in the Netherlands at Rotterdam in 2001. Iftikhar is also the author of Modernism and Art of Muslim South Asia, which received the 2010 book prize from the American Institute of Pakistan Studies. Our second speaker, Elizabeth Giorgis, is professor of theory and criticism at the College of Performing and Visual Art and director of the Museum of at the Modern Art Museum at the Gabriel Christos Desta Center at Addis Ababa University. A curator with lots of exhibitions to her credit, including solo exhibitions of Christos Desta and Olafur Eliasson. Her most recent book, Modernist Art in Ethiopia, was the winner of the 2020 African Studies Association Bethwell A. Algot Prize for the best book on East Asian studies. I would like to welcome Iftikhar to talk to us about Salah Hassan from his own perspective and experience working with my dear friend Salah Hassan. So Iftikhar, welcome.
Thank you, Chika, for the introduction. It's an honor and a privilege to be on this panel to honor my mentor and colleague and friend, Salah Hassan. So I'll begin by discussing my own relationship with Salah, and also to make some general observations. And I hope that in the discussion, we will be able to flesh these out more between all of us. And I also want to emphasize the work that Salah Hassan has done to contribute to the institutional developments at Cornell University in multiple fields, especially in art history, but also in Africana studies. So my own history is that I came to Cornell in 1998 and joined the PhD program in the Department of History of Art. Uh, I began working with Salah Hassan as my advisor. And although my own area is primarily not the art of Africa or its diaspora, there were many common frameworks that I shared with him. And these included the relevance of post-colonial approaches to the study of modern art of the non-Western world and of the global South. It must be stressed that this was a highly neglected field in art history at that time. The discipline did not recognize non-Western modern art that was legitimated by its institutional frameworks and discourses. So, for example, there were no dissertation areas, there were no job titles, etc. And consequently, apart from the exception of very few places, such as the journal Third Text that came out of the UK, there was hardly any place where one could submit essays and articles for publication. Um, Things are quite different now. Things that we still face an uphill battle, but I must emphasize that what the landscape was like um, in the late 90s and early 2000s, where it was basically non-existent. Okay, especially in the US. Um, so for me to work with Salah was very important in this regard because he was one of the pioneers in really uh, developing the study of modern and contemporary art of the global south, not just of African and Africana studies, is what I want to emphasize. And part of the reason I think is his interests are kind of wide and deep and span kind of post-colonial developments from across the world. And even within Africana studies, he was innovative. And I think this is something Chika and Elizabeth can speak more about. But at that time, it is my understanding that very few people thought about the continent and its diaspora in in a continuum, or even between the relationship between North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. And one of the strengths, I think, of Salah Hassan's interests in Africana studies is also to think of these things in complex relationships. And moreover, the issues that are relevant for culture in modern Africa, as well as the questions that its diaspora subjects face, are also issues that are faced, for example, by other regions and its diasporas from the global south in the US, in the UK, in the Francophone world, in Latin America, for example. Consequently, approaches that emphasize comparison, methodology, cross-disciplinary frameworks and perspectives are extremely fruitful in addressing these areas of modern and contemporary art and the relationship of these artistic forms with these communities and peoples in both regional and national frameworks, but also in transnational and global frameworks. So another thing I want to emphasize about Salah Hassan is his, I would say, the Catholicity of his interests. He has published widely in multiple platforms, edits the journal Inca, is very active in the African Studies Association, and in many other cross-disciplinary kind of approaches and formations. Um, and so his approaches have been multiple, also in his initiatives, from training doctoral students, curating exhibitions on major but neglected artists and movements, in his editing and publishing initiatives, and in institutional developments, especially at Cornell, but also beyond, and now with the Africa Center as the latest venture. Salah was chair of the Department of History of Art at a crucial time This is the time when I arrived there, soon after, when a number of senior faculty had retired. Consequently, by developing a consensus among the faculty, he was able to reorient the department with a vision that emphasized comparison, global perspectives, and this included not just the art of the modern world, but also more traditional areas such as medieval art. The department has grown in size during his time as chair and since, and its faculty expertise represents among the most diverse profiles in its engagement, with the values of focusing on emerging areas of research in all periods and geographic areas. Uh, and as head of the Africana Studies and Research Center at Cornell, Salah built that program in a very major way through new hires, through the starting of a PhD program, and through the founding of a new an addition of a new building structure, which added more space and facilities. And I also need to mention the curatorial work that Salah Hassan has done. This is extremely important for the area that I'm discussing, which is the modern art of the non-Western world, because this area has not been examined or had not been examined either by scholarship or even by museum collections. So his exhibitions and curatorial projects have been uniformly groundbreaking because he works on extremely important artists and movements and themes, but which have been overlooked by the museum world and by academic scholarship. And this is one way where good exhibitions also lead to interest in these movements, and consequently the interest by the museum world and academic scholarship actually follows curatorial projects rather than precedes it. There are two projects I worked with Salah closely. One was Unpacking Europe at the Boymans Museum in Rotterdam, which opened soon after September 11, 2001. So it was a very charged time. And it was also a time when this was a major exhibition that looked at the idea of Europe historically and its contemporary form by artists who are located all over the world. And the second project I want to talk about is the artist Ibrahim Al-Salahi, who is one of the leading artists, modern artists from Africa, but who had a very important career and work, but which was entirely neglected. And Salah embarked on a long-term to document his work, to understand his work in scholarly and critical frameworks, and to bring it to attention. I'm fortunate to have worked with him on this project, and it has resulted in now Ibrahim Al-Salahi being justifiably recognized and is actually well known for African art history and for global art history. So let me end here because I hope we'll be able to pick up some of these and other ideas in our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Iftikhar, for that very informative foray into the wide-ranging career and achievements of Salah Hassan. Let me give Elizabeth the platform to talk a little bit more about Salah's work from her own perspective and experience. So Elizabeth,
thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. It's like Iftikhar said, it's a great honor to celebrate Professor Hassan today, who is a good friend of mine, as well as my boss, as well as my mentor. So in all three categories, we have different relationships in all three categories. Anyway, I prepared a note because for me, he had been a very instrumental person. So I prepared a note that I want to read. So when people in the art world talk about him, they recognize and appreciate his curatorial work, a production of knowledge that has shaped and formed an understanding of modernism that centers on specific African histories and schools of thought. Professor Hassan's critical exhibitions have brought into dialogue a generation of African artists from all over the continent. These exhibitions have therefore brought forth a collective vision, theory, and practice that without art historians like him would have been inconceivable. For those of us who are introduced to art history under his tutelage, we witnessed a new disciplinary concept and an exciting field of study in African art and culture. Contrary to the stereotypical categories of the European Academy that reduced the body of knowledge that's imbued in African art and culture, we reconceptualized Africa as both as a theoretical category and redefined the multiple images of the continent and the possibility of Africa that flourished across the continent and into the diaspora during the early years of decolonization. At Cornell University, where I was a student, and Salah Hassan served as the chair of the Department of History of Art and Visual Studies, critical intellectual positions among students and faculty produced significant tropes of study because of a renewed and inclusive curriculum in art history. It was during his tenure as chair of the department that theories, like Iftikhar said, of non-Western art and criticism were added to the familiar narratives of art history. Students were encouraged to examine the aesthetic imaginings of decolonization, its application and meaning that occurred globally after the Second World War. So there is no doubt that for students like me, Cornell's transformed art history department played an important role in locating my own voice and history in the larger history of Western modernity. So I took a wide, most of us who are students took a wide and pluralist view of modernity and modernism that ultimately informed our work that continues to evolve. So he's one of the few pioneering intellectuals who wrote extensively on African modernism and its link to national independence and anti-colonial struggles. His broader examination of the politics of decolonization and post-colonial modernism played a fundamental role in constructing African modernists who evolved in different frameworks and in varied circumstances. So I just want to quote, as he wrote in 2010, quote, "The dominant history of Western modernism leaves out the massive infusions of non-Western artists and cultures into the metropolitan heartland throughout the 20th century. He states artists' intellectual production is essential to any reconsideration of what constitutes global modernity as it overlaps with that of their contemporary European counterparts." So he asks, so what do we understand by African modernism and what is African and African modernity and modernism? And how does African modernity operate in global contexts and how could it be defined or theorized? So it's precisely because of these queries that the meanings and ideology behind African modernism began to shift. So one must also recognize Professor Hassan's significant achievements in showcasing African artists in global art platforms, and particularly in places that had historically been close to Africa. I was fortunate enough to attend one of the first major exhibitions of such an endeavor, Authentic Eccentric, Africa in and Out of Africa, that was part of the 49th Venice Biennale. So co-curated by him and Olu Ogwebe, the exhibition featured cutting-edge 7 prominent contemporary African artists who dealt with the questions of diaspora, exile, memory, representation, perhaps for one of the first few times that this came about in global art platforms. So the exhibition Fault Lines that was curated by Gillian Tedros in 2003 at the 50th Venice Biennale was part of this project of, so questions like how does modernism perceive exclusion and inclusion? How can we give voice to the silence surrounding the historical, cultural, and political configuration of the imperial colonial matrix of power? Can a contemporary decolonial aesthetic simply exist without presuming the history of colonialism and its legacy? How can we extend the theoretical salience of modernism? So clearly the exhibitions, perhaps for the first time, the fault lines and authentic eccentric in the history of African art were marked with such interrogation. So here I would like to talk about Professor Hassan's unique strategy of mentorship and support from my own experience, which I've received for the last, 20-something years since I've known him. So I met Salah Hassan in the mid-1990s through the late Iskandar Bogosian, one of the most prominent Ethiopian modernists. I was a banker in New York with limited knowledge of the history of African art, although I was friends with several Ethiopian artists and was involved in promoting their works. With Salah Hassan's encouragement, I began to write about African art on Inca, the contemporary African art journal that he and others had recently founded. At the time, my unrefined writing and ultimately my poor understanding of non-Western modernism required professional labor, which Salah graciously undertook, so that it can meet the intellectual publication standards of Inca. He adjusted my work with utmost care since he did not want to hurt my feelings. He always said, "You're right here when you say this, but would it not be better if we say this instead?" So I cringe today when I see the original drafts and wonder why he even bothered to consider me a writer. I remember again when in 2003, he asked me again to write on Salim Mokria, the Ethiopian filmmaker who was featured on the Fault Line exhibition. The exhibition catalog highlighted some of the most outstanding and prominent scholars of the time, such as Stuart Hall. So young and bold, I was excited to be part of this project. I wrote an article on Salim's work only to find it required substantial rewriting to bring it to the standard it deserved. So again, without hurting my feeling, Salah gently guided me to rewrite the essay in such a way that it can articulate the complexities of Salim's work. And along the way, he made sure I understood the wider intellectual thoughts behind African filmmakers like Salim Mokria. I was not an academic in 2003, neither was I a student of art history. I was just someone he met who was simply interested in African art. Yet he was eager to afford me knowledge, which he thought would ultimately help me in becoming an engaged public. For me, it's precisely this unique, inspiring character that makes Salah Hassan an exceptional scholar. So as I've indicated, and Iftikhar has indicated also, one can talk about many of his curatorial accomplishments and his significant intervention in deconstructing the European modern, universal through the voluminous articles and books that he has published. Through his work, he has brilliantly brought forth modernity's multiple fragments, ruptures, and imaginations, and its encounter with Africa. For instance, his recent work on Ibrahim Al-Salahi, which Iftikhar mentioned, Ibrahim Al-Salahi, a visionary modernist, a retrospective exhibition that was held at the Tate Modern, and a catalog that really was accompanied by a catalog that was really enlightening. He said about Ibrahim, when I think about Ibrahim, he said, Salah said, I think about all the post-colonial intellectuals of the time. He asked Ibrahim about the Sudanese intellectuals who went to the West for colonial education and came back to the school in Khartoum. Of course, Salah mentions his favorite Sudanese author, Taib Salih, and his novel, Seasons of Migration to the North, which is a story about the conflicts of modern Sudan and the history of British colonialism. It's about the African who was returned to Sudan after an education abroad and the incidents that had transpired after his return and the disillusionment of return, etc. For those of us who know Salah, we have frequently heard about Taib Salih and these two novels, Season of Migration to the North and The Wedding of Zayn. I've received the two books as gifts from Salah. His interest in Taib Salih's novels hones on the role of the post-colonial intellectual in the making of modernity. So this type of intervention has influenced my own work, particularly my book, which took, without the most important historical period that fundamentally changed the course of modern African history are artists like Ibrahim Al-Salahi and intellectuals like Salih, who worked very closely with each other, as in the rest of the continent, where artists and intellectuals work together to bring forth the sensibility of African modernism. And their generation's aesthetic, intellectual, and political consequences continue to legitimate the spaces of knowledge production. So what Salah is telling us is that any study of artists' work naturally entails the intellectual histories of the time. So my own book, as I said earlier, on Ethiopian modernism, that premised this relationship as an important point of departure was greatly inspired by Salah's intellectual intervention. Professor Hassan's current position as the director of the Africa Institute, where I am now, in Sharjah, where I'm currently a senior fellow, is without doubt one of his boldest undertakings, and perhaps one of the most interesting ventures of his scholarly work. The two histories, that of the Arab Gulf region in Africa, and particularly East Africa, have always intersected. The cross-cultural influences of these two regions share deep historical roots, and certainly the Africa Institute is currently playing an important role in expanding research and documentation on the histories and identities of this crossroads. Most importantly, the contemporary scholarship between Africa and the Arab Gulf is redefining the region in unprecedented ways. Here too, the Africa Institute is serving as a space for wider and contemporary social, cultural, and political engagements. In October 2020 of last year, for instance, the Africa Institute held an international scholarly conference called Ethiopia, Modern Nation, Ancient Roots. With a diverse and engaged attendance, the conference hosted a range of scholars, interdisciplinary scholars, to consider issues of Ethiopian modernity within a wider context. So, as many of you are aware, Ethiopia is currently going through massive political turmoil and upheaval. And it is these types of conferences and the publications around such gatherings that are key to theorize the overarching themes behind present day conflicts, its historical and political contexts, and the transnational nature of global capital and power relations. For many of us who participated in this conference and whose feelings are raw because of recent conflicts, we were able to voice our opinions to the political elite who are creating havoc. For many of us, the Africa Institute, that's not too far from home, served as a rare platform that allowed us to exchange and share ideas in addition to producing knowledge that sustained our humanity, even when everything else faltered. And Salah, again, is playing a pivotal role in theorizing Africa's contemporary social, political, and cultural circumstance. That said, I would like to conclude and share more of Salah's humanity through my own friendship with him. Indeed, he had been my greatest academic mentor, but he has also been my most valued friend. He has been my professor, the stern African chief of a professor, but he's also my easygoing and compassionate friend. I've known him to be a shrewd academic and negotiator in his administrative positions at Cornell, but I have also seen him easily swayed. He encouraged me to go back to graduate school in art history since I hated my banking profession. I was a Wall Street MBA when I joined NYU's Museum Studies program. His support played a key role in that decision. I never imagined that a couple of years later, after graduating from NYU, that I would be a PhD candidate in art history at Cornell University. My graduate studies at Cornell would not have materialized if it had not been for him. He taught me to be a critical scholar, a broad-minded human being with the depth and sensibility of our shared African ancestors. I went back to Ethiopia and established a graduate program in critical studies. I produced many students whose future scholarship, I hope, will fundamentally change the course of Ethiopian studies, which has contributed to our present-day political and humanitarian quagmire. I asked a former student who's currently a postdoc fellow at the Africa Institute on how I should write about Salah. He said I should begin with, in Amharic, Astemro and Astemri Aderrege, one who invested in my critical knowledge and one who opened the door for me to teach others what I have learned from him. Today, there are many students who write me letters on how this course and the other that I had taught them have opened their eyes to understand issues of identity, ethnicity, plurality, the existence of peripheries in the center and centers in the periphery, etc., questions that have not been critically deliberated in Ethiopian scholarship, and issues that have contributed to Ethiopia's present-day political crisis. They are questions that should be urgently unpacked if we are to survive as a nation. In deeply affecting, thought-provoking reflections, Salah Hassan introduced me to the sensibility of African aesthetic, and through that journey, he also helped me voice the particular and contextual poise of emancipatory ideas to an Ethiopian generation that urgently needs to comprehend these theories and concepts. And thank you, Salah.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for that wonderful testimony to Salah's scholarship and his deep, humane character. And with that, I would like for us to move to the second segment of this presentation. And that's a conversation with Salah Hassan. Given that I have suggested that we do a conversation, I would lead us through certain paths and trajectories of your career, and hope that I would learn one or two things in the process, even after these many years. And I would like to begin, really, not with your work at Cornell or with your work presently at the Art Institute, the Africa Institute in Sharjah. I would actually like to begin in the Sudan, your homeland. And the reason I want to do this, Salah, is that I suspect that Sudan was and has been very formative to your career as an art historian. You had your first degree in the Sudan. You taught there as a very young scholar before you moved to the United States for further studies and what became the unfurling and unfolding of your career at different institutions in the United States. I'm also aware, because we've talked about this for quite a long time now, that you're working on a memoir. Well, I wouldn't ask you to give us details as yet, because I'm sure your future publisher might not appreciate that. But I'm interested in the working title of your memoir, Between a Rock and the Hard Place. Now, for a friend who has been extremely successful as an art historian, curator, director of institutions, to read a title that says between a rock and a hard place, I don't know what to make of that. But I'm sure you have good reason for such a curious title. So what has this got to do with the memoir and, I suspect, the career that unfolded since your days in the Sudan?
Let me begin by really saying thank you to you, Chika, as a friend. We have been in this struggle together and for a long time. And I couldn't have done it without people like you or Okwe and Razor. The same goes for Elizabeth and Iftikhar. I thank you really for these moving statements and presentations. It is very humbling, but it's also put a lot of pressure on me to continue down that path and with more enthusiasm. hopefully, I will continue to do so. In response to your question, Chika, I find it to be very inspiring because it helps me a great deal to move the conversation towards more of what I call an intellectual autobiography, because, or so to speak, because that's where it's possible for me to highlight threads or themes that cut across my career choices and paths since my early beginnings in Sudan. I am at the stage, as you mentioned, of writing bits and pieces of my own autobiography and our intellectual journey. And I titled it Between a Rock and a Hard Place. I mean, it stands for me, Between a Rock and a Hard Place, it stands for me as a metaphor that really comes in handy. I have, throughout my life, faced very difficult choices or tough choices between unsatisfactory or difficult options. And this often compels me to seek the most challenging routes. As I have mentioned to you earlier in our conversations, that my life, and more specifically my political, my ideological, my scholarly and intellectual choices or leanings seem to revolve or evolve, for a better word, around making these difficult choices and choosing challenging answers to them. For example, I was born in the southern part of Sudan, in the city of Juba. And now, because of the partition, it's now part of South Sudan. But my family were northerners at the time of the civil war between the ruling elites in the government of Sudan at the time after independence and the southern Sudanese, mostly highlighted by the rebel groups that are actually, in my view, our liberation movement at the time that chose to pick up, what we now call as the armed struggle. Of course, it's rooted in the identity and identification of who is Sudan itself. The conflict, of course, was north-south. It was never really between people. It was between ruling elite who are highly Arabized and rebels who came mostly from the southern part of Sudan, at least in its earlier manifestation, which is the Ananya one. And that was at the time when I was a young kid in the southern part of Sudan. So the questions around identity and identification became symptomatic of, or kind of a metaphor for that struggle. You're either a Muslim or an African. You're either an Arab or an African, and you have to make these choices. So rather than celebrating a casual diversity, it became a curse. And this is because of the elites, the ruling elites, of being blind to the idea of the richness and celebration of unity in diversity. So the whole question of what is Sudan and what is Sudanese and what is Sudanese culture becomes a big issue for me. Growing up, also moving to the north for reasons of schooling and going into the university, there was also career choices. As you know, traditionally, the choice is either you become a doctor or engineer or at best a lawyer. And at the time, I was a practicing artist, believe it or not. And maybe if I chose that path, Chika, you would be writing about me. But anyway, that hasn't been, I ended up on the other side. So I wanted to study in the College of Fine and Applied Art. And my mother and my family were really opposed to that choice because everyone wanted me to be a medical doctor. I entered the College of Science, which is almost like a pre-med and a preclinical. But at some point in the second year of that study, I just felt this is not my interest. And I moved and shifted to the College of Arts and Letters at the time. It's called the Faculty of Arts and Letters in the University of Khartoum. And I studied philosophy and history. And I actually specialized with a degree in what they call it an honors, a Bachelor of Honors in philosophy, which is basically you stay according to the British system 1 year and you do that. But then also I was faced after graduation with a difficult choice. What do? You become a bureaucrat, a teacher in remote areas of what they call it hardship areas. You start and you build up your career to move to the major cities. And I just thought, okay, where is my passion? So I was lucky to pursue a career in art history, and I was recruited to the College of Fine and Applied Arts, then in Khartoum, to join the Faculty of Art History and Aesthetics. So I was sent abroad to study, but what was interesting for me at the time in terms of the choices of careers, it was difficult. It was difficult, but it was easy because Sudan was experiencing in the 60s and 70s, when I came of age or getting to the university level, a true renaissance in culture and in the field of politics. There was a multi-party system. There is a renaissance of literature and the art. The Khartoum School was at its climax in literature. Novels that Elizabeth has pointed to were really like Tayyib Salih and others were read. There was also underground reading groups of even radical literature. We've read Frantz Fanon in Arabic. We've read Marx, Lenin. We've read all of these, Pan-African thinkers, Nkrumah, ideas of African socialism were abundant, and the student movement specifically was very strong. So these are what helped me make that kind of choice. And then I went to the United States to study. And I recall I was actually almost like alone and an exception when I was accepted at the University of Pennsylvania to study art history and also folklore at the time. And because most of the African students who came on a scholarship, they were in the areas of engineering, there were areas of political economy or economics and other, what they call it tangible, field, where you go back and you can find a profession. And then comes September 11, and I, as somebody who's of a Muslim background, partly Arabized, there was all that strange question when you find yourself caught between another rock and a hard place. And I recall very well after September 11 when Bush posed a major question, is that you are either with us or with the terrorists. I mean, I don't have to be either. There is always a third way. So finally comes the field that I really wanted to study, which is African art history, which is really at the time was not that available. And the choices becomes really the major question is that how do we really reposition that field within the larger discourses of art history? And you have to put
So let me ask you, Salah, about the turn that happens at the moment of your enrollment at UPenn in an art history program and the Salah Hassan that would eventually know as an art historian. And I'm asking this because your first book, which came out of your dissertation research, was actually on art and Islamic literacy among the Hausa of northern Nigeria. What happened?
At the time, I felt there was a challenge that's facing many of us who come from Africa or a third world background, or the global south, for a better word, is that you're always thought to be the spokesperson for your own culture, that you have to go to Sudan and you have to study Sudan and come, while others have the right to study any other. So I found it in an interesting challenge, and because of my interest in the nature of Islam in Sudan, which seemed to be a much more Africanized form of Islam, that form of Islam that's hybrid, I felt Nigeria is a great place to study this. Why Nigeria? Because there is a huge population of Nigerians in Sudan, and they were very well known in the area of Islamic magic or Islamic, amulets, and they were actually also clerics, and they were known for their piety and devotion. And these are part of series of migrations from the medieval period, people who wanted to go to Hajj, they crossed the desert, they ended up in Sudan. So I was fascinated by the culture of Islamic literacy and its relationship to art and to magic. So that was one question. The other question is also I was also experienced that in Western notions of Islam, there is always a notion to equate it with orthodoxy, which is very similar to Muslim fundamentalists, that the yardstick of your Islam is the book and the tradition of the Prophet, rather than thinking of Islam as a very, how do you call it, pragmatic religion that actually adapted and shaped. So, and so I felt, how do I fit that? But also I was fascinated with the idea of going to another place and doing field work, learning a language and going back, which is the typical ethnographic research at the time. So I took up that challenge, studied Hausa, went to northern Nigeria, because that's where I saw an example, a clear example of an African Islam. And at the time, there is really the scholarship on the relationship between Islam and African art was really almost zero, with the exception of a catalog and a book by René Braverman on Islam and tribal art in West Africa, and Hatumeri, which is a book on architecture by Labelle Toussaint. So those who really opened up the door for me to study that. So it was my interest in the art of African Islam, but it's also, I felt it's a book that could also rethink the idea of the aesthetic of Islam itself. For example, in Islamic art, there was always this debate about the figural representation and the iconoclastic stand of Islamic art. So that was one dimension I thought I could explore in that sense. The other one is bringing attention to a neglected area within Islamic art itself, which is because the Islamic art history which is what I actually picked up and studied with Renato Holodin, is focus on the area of the Near East, and that is associated with early Islam, or the Islamic caliphates and so forth up to the Ottoman Empire, but it neglects the impact of Islam in the area that's called so-called Sub-Saharan Africa, because Egypt, Tunisia, Morocco are always included, even the Andalusian or the Iberian Peninsula, but there was a complete neglect of the art of Islamic, of African Islam. And most important is that it helps me emphasize one thing, is that there is not one Islam. There are many Islam, as the Egyptian late scholar Abdul Hamid al-Zain has focused, is that it really, we must move beyond the orthodoxy of the book and the tradition to thinking about Islam as hybrid, and also can be shaped by other experiences. So, and it also allowed me to think, and that's the last point that I want to emphasize, is the uses of the written word in Islamic, whatever you call it, Islamic magic, Islamic medicine, and others, but it's also its adaptation within the art, because one discovery that I have there is that most of the Muslim clerics, or they call them in northern Nigeria malams, are actually the artists who actually involve in architecture, in these babangidas, the biggest gowns that you see, even up to the area of the Yoruba and southern part of Nigeria, are all, if you look closely, are influenced by Islamic design that came through the culture of the book. And then when you really go to either Lagos, or you go to Kano, or Zaria, or Maiduguri, you will discover always in every single market, there's a huge culture of books. There's a huge section of Islamic manuscripts that are actually shaped by decades of Africanization. But it also allowed me to think about forms of calligraphy and how they are actually adapted in that area, which is what came to be known as the African calligraphy, which is, well, an Afriqi style of calligraphy.
That's quite fascinating, these explorations that you began your career as a scholar. Now, I'm quite curious, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later on, in terms of the incidence of, or rather the beginnings of art historical scholarship on Northern Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East, and what eventually Iftikhar and others who have contributed immensely to this, calligraphic modernism, right? So to see that your career actually began with an ethnographic study of calligraphy and associated cultures, and then to see the amount of work that you would then go forward to do and also encourage others to embrace, which is modernism in predominantly Islamic regions of North Africa and the Middle East and South Asia. But after this first phase of your research, it was also about the same time that it seems to me your earlier foray into art, contemporary art, as in a would-be artist yourself, and also being in Khartoum, as you mentioned earlier, with the work of the Khartoum school, Ibrahim Al-Salahi, and others there in Addis Ababa. This was the moment in the early 1990s that I first met you, right? For that project, incredible project, our dear friend and brother, Okwe-Agulu, who, by the way, would have been thrilled to be part of this conversation celebrating your scholarship and achievement, Salah. But be that as it may, the moment when Okwe identified this lacuna in the art industry, in the art scholarship, and reached out to you and others. You did mention Oluoguibe, myself, and several others in the early 1990s to begin this journal called Nka, which you have for the past 2 decades tremendously helped ensure its longevity. And we'll talk about your work as an institution builder later on. But if you could speak a little bit to the need for that journal at a time when, as you rightly pointed out earlier, there was no field of modern and contemporary African art in the scholarship and in the discipline. What is it that made you join forces with Okwe and others to begin work on this journal? And with hindsight, how do you see that history and that work with the journal Nka?
Let me begin by saying that had I talked about at least thanking people earlier, I would have actually dedicated this award to pass it on or dedicate it to Okwe-Agulu, because he was really a visionary. And being a friend, being a colleague, I learned a lot from him. His daring style, his abilities, to engage, his ability to really enter the field with such passion and to be an advocate for it, of course, led to this. I mean, I recall very well that he approached me about this. That is, he had the whole vision and so forth. He was actually the founding publisher himself. And I recall our first meeting, which was at the African Studies Association in Toronto, where he actually traveled at the time, so the train from New York City up to Toronto, and we met. And he had the maquette of the first issue. And of course, prior to that, he asked us for contribution, you and others. I recall very well the composition of that, or the content of that. So he was obviously had the pulse of history at his hand. And he realized that, as we all realized at the time, because as you know, at the time, publishing platforms like Art Journal, like Art Bulletin, a very few are not open to colleagues like us and people in fields like African or African American and others. I mean, it struck me as when I was just looking at the latest issue of Art Journal, that it was dedicated to Blackness. And the editor herself emphasized in a video that you can actually watch on the website of the CAA itself as an organization, that this is the first time since its establishment for this journal to dedicate something on race or blackness. So let alone when we speak about the early 90s when we met, and it became an urgently needed platform as an alternative to publish on contemporary African and African American and also African diaspora. And I must say from the beginning, as Okwe and all of us shared the idea is that we can no longer talk about Africa as a geographic entity. We need to talk about it as a global presence. So from the beginning, these dichotomies between Africa and African American, Africa and the diaspora, especially in the field of visual art, especially in the literature, movement go back and forth. The Harlem Renaissance was an influence on Africa. Jazz has an influence in South Africa and so forth. If you look at blues, that's circular or the metaphor of the sailing ship, as many in the field of African and African diaspora studies emphasize now, like Paul Gilroy, for example, and so forth. So this has become from the beginning, we abandon this dichotomy. The other one that is also another dichotomy that we abandon is the distinction between North and Sub-Saharan Africa. We felt these kind of artificial, arbitrary boundaries are part of the legacy of colonialism, or the colonial legacy in African studies itself. Remember, until very recently, African studies mostly focused on Sub-Saharan Africa, to the neglect of North Africa. It was only now that, ironically, with the influence of Pan-Africanists and Afrocentrists, but it's also diasporic intellectuals like Fanon and others, that Africa became to be seen as whole. And of course, the discipline of art history, and especially African art history, was a latecomer to this. So that's a major breakthrough that we made through this journal. And it filled the gap in bringing visibility to African artists. At the time, there was always the complaint when you say to curators in major institution, mainstream institution, they say, well, there is Ibrahim Al-Salahi, or there is this artist, why don't you exhibit them? The answer has always been, we don't know anything about them. There's no writing about them. So that's a gap. In the last 25 years, Inca put all of these artists on the map. And as I said, it also placed contemporary African art in the global perspective. It filled that gap. Although there are other, to their credit, there are other platforms. There is African art, but had a great beginning globally during the time of John Povey. And then later on, it became focused on the classical tradition of African art. But now it becomes an all-encompassing. There was also short-lived platform like Revue Noir, gallery in Zimbabwe, Art South Africa now, Sue Williamson, great website on South African art. And then also Mancha Diawara's initiative of Black Renaissance Noir. These are there.
Of course, there was Third Text, right? Published out of London. Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah. Prior to that, of course, the one inspiration was Rashid Araeen's effort.
Could I ask you, just a follow-up? What was the experience for you, both through your work in UNCA and in your own scholarship, of identifying your work with Africa? So UNCA was a journal of contemporary African art, even though it covered well beyond Africa as a continental entity. But in terms of your work as an art historian, what sort of pressures did you experience being an Africanist art historian? If you could just speak briefly about that within the discipline of art history.
Within the discipline of art history, that is something that I was going to speak about in the context of institution building. Because often as an Africanist, as they call it, art historian, you find yourself at the margin. Like the courses that you teach are not necessarily incorporated within the larger linear development of the department. You have to remember art history in terms of lines, faculty lines, is always defined from the ancient through the classical, through the medieval, through the modern and the contemporary. And then when there is other, fields like South Asian art or Asian art and so forth, they are at the margin. And it's only like one or two people. So they are not incorporated into that. Of course, one learned from working with INCA or the field of curating is that, especially when you talk about the contemporary field and the modern art field, is that it's very much interconnected. You can never talk about an artist like Ibrahim Al-Salahi or write about them without thinking of their education in Britain, their evolving and growing up during the colonial period. So they are part of that post-colonial generation that's a product of the British colonial education. And that also that you will learn that modernity, as Edward Said said, has many parents. And you cannot talk about modern European without Islamic or other earlier movements or intellectual movement that came out of the Islamic era. The Renaissance has always been indebted to Islam and to mathematics and to other philosophical, and Islam itself as a civilization was also linked to ancient Greece and others. So this movement of translation and connections between culture cannot be denied, as it is specifically in the era of the modern and so forth. So you cannot analyze Salah without thinking about the slave school, and you cannot analyze Salah without thinking about his earlier beginning as a student, let's say even in an Islamic school, where he learned certain calligraphy and other styles of art when he was a kid. And without thinking about also ancient Sudanese civilization. So these are all interconnectedness that one learns through practice of teaching or researching the modern and contemporary, but it's also through publishing and through INCA as a platform that actually became a space of debating ideas around the modern and the contemporary.
So one of the key things that both Elizabeth and Iftikhar had mentioned in your work is this very crucial connection between making art history and exhibition work, right? Your curatorial experience and your scholarship are intimately tied, right? In the sense that on the one hand, you have been involved in major exhibitions, and we'll talk about these briefly, but these also presented tremendous occasions for producing substantial scholarship, right? That then becomes the ground for future work in art history. So for instance, the second project that we collaborated on was the Whitechapel exhibition in 1995, 7 stories about modern art in Africa, for which you served as a co-curator. But today, that project has become one of the classic works in the historiography of modern and contemporary African art. What did that exhibition do for you at that point in time, both as a curator, but also as a scholar within the discipline of art history?
It's actually happened at a time earlier in my career. I just started teaching in the late early 90s, and it came as a great opportunity because at that time I shifted from the art of African Islam after working on the book on the art of Islamic literacy in northern Nigeria, because I felt that was a challenge that was accomplished, and I felt what I really came to study was the contemporary art. So it came at that time and at that junction, allowed me to do research on 2 areas, Sudan, but also Ethiopia, which I collaborated on with Asha Debela, who is an artist from Ethiopia at the time, and we worked together on the Ethiopia side. But what I really found interesting in that project is, first, it allows the process of curating and selecting is one, but it's also, it produced, and this is what I really find it important in exhibitions as a source of knowledge production, is that it produced a richly documented book that present an art history of the modern experience in Africa through these 7 stories where you came in terms of Nigeria and others. So it helped me think about how to position the debate on African modernism. And I think that book did a great service in that, because that's actually, after a long pause of interest. You have to remember, there was an interest in the post on the earlier independence era in African art. You see it as the major exhibition in the Camden Art Center, for example. And in
London, right?
The interest of the Harmon Foundation in the 60s in African artists and some of the catalog that and the work that they collected, but also in some few exhibitions here and there in Washington, DC, among others. But then suddenly there was a pause, and there was a long period of time where there is no interest in African. Africa 95 actually renewed that as part of course, a larger festival, behind which people that we must not forget, like Robert Loder, and also our colleague Clementine Delis, that actually championed this project too, is that it ended up producing this document that is very interesting. And then the other idea is that one would learn, not just within the context of Africa, that is the idea of multiple modernism, and that also African modernism through these stories is no longer a derivative, and that also we realize how through these stories, whether it's the Senegalese, whether it's the Ethiopian or the Nigerian, is that modernism is a two-way traffic, and that also there are other modernism that has to be. So the book actually was very useful because it was adopted by many classes in African art as a field. That is when the shift started happening in North American universities and Europe in terms of the teaching of art history. That book became an important source because it also, maybe people didn't pay attention to this, that beside the essays and the sections, there was a wonderful section that is of documentations and archival material that was very useful for people. First time you learn about what happened in Senegal, not just through the exhibit itself that Haji C did with the group of Rabattoir Agita, but there was also a whole set of documents on the negritude, on Senghor and others. For me, it was very helpful to translate manifestos, and for you too and others, these kind of schools that nobody heard of at the time. So that was, I think it was a monumental exhibit, and it needs to be revisited within art history and to think about its role.
So you had that project, the 7 stories in 1995. And that was about trying to create narratives, art histories, if you will, of the modern within the context of Africa. In 2001, you and Iftikhar, and you considered a team to organize the exhibition that Iftikhar already mentioned earlier on, Unpacking Europe. I would like to talk about this just a little bit, precisely because that was a major initiative to actually question, to actually analyze Europe's identity, which was a radical thing because you studied the identities of the others, but not of the self. But this was a project that turned the searchlight to Europe itself. And what has happened since? Crisis of identity in Europe. So in a way, that exhibition, I believe, signaled the way that your scholarship worked. It's not always about let's speak about ourselves, right, as Africans, as we're from the global South and so forth, but to turn your post-colonial theoretical and analytical rigor to how the so-called center imagined itself, right? And that was the project that became Unpacking Europe. How did you come about doing such a project, and what kind of alliances did you need and find to make such a project possible?
You know, this is really an interesting story because there are like just so many factors. I think Iftikhar talked about this a little bit, and I would ask him to even make further comment. But before I say that, what is really intriguing about the story of Unpacking Europe, and prior to that, actually, the exhibit at the Venice Biennial, Authentic Eccentric, that Elizabeth also talked about, is the story of behind the scene of what happened. Because these are factors that often when art history is written, these kind of things get to be neglected. I must say that at the time, almost like the stars have aligned in a way that is allowed us, because there was a shift in the field. There was a lot of challenges intellectually by by the Black radical tradition, by the African intellectual tradition, by also others, but others also within Europe itself. People like Rashid Arain and so forth, it started to challenge this homogeneous narrative of Europe. Remember, at the time, Rashid Arain did his show, The Other Story, in response, of course, to the Magicien de la Terre and also to just general neglect and otherization of South Asian, African, and Black artists from the Caribbean in London. So there was some hints that actually helped me as a student at the time, or at least beginning my career in the field or in curating, is to think about subjects that actually return the gaze. Because, and here's what happened. I was invited by the committee that was supposed to be responsible of selecting a curator for the Rotterdam as a cultural capital for Europe. And the expectation at the time, I'm not sure or not, but that is to do something on Africa. So I thought, actually, even in a joking way, I said, why don't I just turn the table and ask the other question, is to unpack Europe itself. And it was a daring move at the time, because I was a junior colleague or a junior professor at Cornell. You know, in the field itself, the field is still marginalized, but luckily the committee has great people, Els van der Plas and also Gerardo Mosquera from Cuba. And in addition to Chris Derkon, who used to be the director of the Boisman. So there are people who are actually ready for that change or pushed for it. And I will get back to that also, because the story with Chris Derkon and people like him continued in other formats, is that there are certain people, their presence at a certain time make them take a risk that actually helped a great deal. Because often when you approach many organizations, they wanted to see what is the take back home, what is the outcome in advance, without thinking about saying, okay, this is something that may change history. Take a chance in it. So I would say that was one factor. But for us, it was important, and I worked with Iftikhar closely on this, is the idea of trying to examine this construction of Europeanness. But we also wanted it in terms of artists, which we actually about up to 18 or 19 or 20 artists. Iftikhar, you can correct me if I'm wrong. But also, we insisted on producing a companion volume to it of critical writing. And at the time, actually, we approached people who considered big start in the field of post-colonial studies and so forth. Luckily, they were really cooperated and work with us on the volume itself. You'll find the likelihood of Dipesh Chakrabarti, you will find Martin Bernal, among many others that actually contribute to that. But we also insisted on having a section in which we highlight the career of those artists. So we commission those artists, and the major questions for us is for them to think about what Europe means to them. And that is, you know, to think about the contradictions between this kind of homogenizing official narrative and the everyday realities of urban lives in Europe, where it is heterogeneous, it is hybrid, and that was for a long have been the norms of what European cities are. If you can think about Paris, can you think about this without the Negritude movement, without Présence Africaine, without all these intellectuals from the Caribbean, Frantz Fanon, Aimé Césaire? These are part and parcel of that European metropolis. London is the same. Can you think about it without Stuart Hall or a C.L.R. James or all these intellectuals? So the reality has always been hybrid, but the narrative has been very homogenized, very, you know, very Eurocentric. So the theme happened to be really timely, I would say, given the political climate in Europe itself and the shifting demographics. So the artists that we invited are actually a combination of European artists of European origin, but also others who are European, but of other origins, whether it's Asia, Africa, and others, and also artists in Africa and others. So it was really a combination of many, and the result was amazing of these commissioned, and the book itself became a textbook for many people. I've gotten many messages from colleagues who were very grateful that we provided this book at a time that the academy is really lacking that. So Iftikhar.
No, thanks for asking me. That was I think it was as Salah mentioned, an important project, you know, at the time, and it also had to. There were a couple of other factors that worked in our favor. One is that it was planned right before September 11th, so in some sense, all the planning and, you know, was done. So, and the government at that time was also favorable to. You know, it's a liberal kind of government. Okay. The second factor that worked in our favor is that the Boymans was actually planning to undergo renovation. So they had made they had cancelled, or they had not planned shows at the time, and Unpacking Europe was supposed to go up. So we actually had a big space. You know, we had almost double the space that we would have had otherwise. So that was also a very important kind of factor. And of course, the artists, as Salah mentioned, were a combination of artists actually located all over the world, thinking about, you know, some of European kind of, you know, legacy, some from kind of, you know, the global South, living in different places, but all of them thinking about the, you know, the complex legacies of Europe and empire, both historically and into the present. So Stuart Hall was gave the keynote speech, you know, so he came and I believe that it was an important exhibition for you know, and as Salah mentioned, the book played a key role in kind of, in a sense, cementing the discursive, you know, and scholarly background to the exhibition.
I want to turn a little bit towards another aspect of your work that Elizabeth and Iftikhar mentioned. You are also vigorously working to advance scholarship on the work of individual African artists, many of whom had no chances of getting any serious attention in any important museum, whether in the United States or even Europe at the time. And I point to the work that you've done for decades with Ibrahim Al-Salahi, who, if you ask me, is arguably the most important modernist that, you know, has come out of Africa. And yet, I know that this was a very hard task. It did not matter that he made some of the most important and significant work as an artist, pure and simple. And yet, introducing his work to the art world was a very long process that, if you will, reached its height in the exhibition at the Tate Modern a few years ago. And yet, the project did not begin at the Tate, right? The Tate did not organize the exhibition. So if you could talk a little bit about what it took to make a project like that possible.
Let me begin by saying this. The reason that I worked on Salahi, and that was for almost more than 20 or 15 years, literally, prior to finding a home and a support for the publication, a home for the exhibit and a support for the publication. It was a real struggle. Iftikhar was part of the journey. You yourself was part of the journey and a contributor to the main catalog, and many other. Okwe himself tried his best to find us a venue, so it was a struggle. But I want to relate this to my own kind of intellectual kind of growth or development revolution in thinking about what is the best contribution to African art history, especially the contemporary and the modern. I realized that with 7 stories, and other exhibits like Africa Remix and so forth, that the stories had been about really group shows that was very helpful in a sense that because it highlighted the career of artists. And no matter what you do, even a bad exhibition with good art in it, the artwork itself can speak for itself in a way that people could pay attention to it. So everything that give that exposure is useful. But for me, when I think about the shift that happened to me, is that it's from these kind of 7 stories into something else, which is to either focus on movements or to do retrospective of artists. Because I felt at the time, that's what the field needs, and actually that's what is still the kind of work that need to be done. The kind of work that require like the work that Elizabeth Giorgis and Iftikhar did, that required serious research, serious field work, serious archiving, not just to gather biographies of artists and do studio visits and then just do the exhibit. Lots of these kind of mega exhibitions, and it's not actually unique to the field of African art. It's also Latin American art, Asian art, Chinese art. You will find that the beginning has always these grand spectacles of shows. That happened in the late 80s and early 90s. So I felt there is a need to push through, but also to really, to kind of overcome that by really focusing on movement. So that's why prior to Ibrahim, I started thinking, and while doing the work for Ibrahim show, I started thinking about shows like Authentic Eccentric, Conceptualism in Contemporary African Art, that came as a book itself. And because it shows that is like when we think about artists, just as an example of movement, the book focus and the exhibit on conceptualism. And it's something that nobody at the time would associate with African art or contemporary or modern art movement. But it was a source of discovery based on research that we discovered that there are these movements that you could think of in terms of in dialogue with European modernism or contemporary art. And you could think about issues of performance art and the ways of how African and African diaspora artists translated their, their Western experiences and social and aesthetic experience also of post-colonial Africa into kind of what I call new idioms of artistic expression that actually, that one could argue to situate within the broad narrative of what Okwe called global conceptualism. You have to remember that at that time, that was also a very influential exhibition, that actually one of those exhibitions that pushed the narrative, opened the boundaries and inserted the story of others. So that show was important in that sense. And it represented a shift in my career to really move towards that. But it's also moved towards more institutionalizing, even though like our interventions. In Venice, we did it three times. We've also established what's called the Forum for African Art. It's short-lived, but I must say also, that what helped in that show, before I shift to answering your question on Ibrahim, is also the support of the Ford Foundation, the support of the Prince Claus Fund, the support of Afrique Creation, people like Florence Alexis, and many others really, who were really believed in this kind of project and were at the right time, at the right moment, provided that support. We couldn't have done it. Venice was a very expensive thing. Well, to come to Ibrahim, it was a struggle. And for a long time, I approached, believe it or not, through the early intervention of INABA, because this project started with INABA during Ghislaine Tawadros as a collaboration between them and also the Museum for African Art in New York during Laurie Farrell time when she was she actually joined this project from the beginning, because the project really started in England and is sponsored by INABA at the beginning. It didn't go anywhere because every single museum, from the Camden Art Center to the Whitechapel to and I'm talking about the Ibrahim show, to the Tate Modern itself, Tate Britain. Remind you that Ibrahim is a Sudanese, but he's also a British citizen. And he was a resident of England in the heart of London and then moved to Oxford for almost 50 years of his life. He studied at the Slade. And so none of these museums, and I remember very well the Hayward Gallery, and the excuse was that this will not bring us any audience. It's a risk. And I'll never forget, this kind of answer from the curators at the time. The same thing with other spaces within London itself. So, and I recall at the time, I just resorted to the idea of let us just publish the catalog, and then whenever the exhibit happened, as you are aware of it, and also Iftikhar has contributed to the catalog. And Iftikhar and other colleagues really helped a great deal with the earlier research and for that. And so, and it was interesting when I came to Sharjah as part of a jury and met Hur Al-Qasimi, who just said to me simply, why didn't you bring this project to our attention? So credit goes to the Sharjah Art Foundation and to the, beside the people who provided funding, including the Andy Warhol Foundation and others, is for taking, I wouldn't say it's a risk, for really championing something that's worthy. And it is that show that opened at the Sharjah Art Museum, is sponsored by both the Sharjah Art Museum and the Sharjah Art Foundation, that opened the door to this exhibit to travel. Often when people try to speak about the Ibrahim show, a visionary modernist, they always cite the Tate Modern, but they forget that it's actually the show opened here, and it was the visit of Jessica Morgan to the show that actually, who is now the head of the Dear Art Foundation, who actually embraced that. At the time she was at the Tate Modern, she embraced that project and took it to the Tate. The Tate took it to the Tate Modern, and the Tate Modern at the time also luckily had the director Chris Deco, who is very familiar with Ibrahim's work, exhibited Ibrahim work in a show that we actually collaborated on. It's called The Future of Tradition of the Future, when he was a director before Okwe of the House de Kunst, for example. So there are some things that align that make it possible to happen. And then afterward, of course, it became a major marker in Ibrahim's career. Museums now that rejected the idea of taking that shows, even after it opened in Sharjah, are now scrambling to acquire his work. And for them, it's too late. Because after that, Ibrahim's career, kind of flourished and reached the market, and many people start acquiring his work. For some museums now, like the Met and others, really at the last minute scrambled to get the last of his masterpieces, so to speak. So this is basically the story of that, is that many of these Western mainstream institutions are not willing to take the risk. And,
yes.
I wanted to add that this is, I believe, the first retrospective exhibition of an African artist in a major museum, in a major Western museum. And the fact that it happened so late, is telling. And we should
Yes.
also think about how many other retrospective, solo exhibitions have happened since of, kind of major African and artists from the global South. It's still not that many.
Julie,
Yes.
just had a retrospective.
Yes.
Which one?
Julie Murray too.
Julie,
Yes.
that's what you said, yeah.
Yes, definitely. What this points to is the foundational nature of Salah's work. That without the groundwork that he has laid out, these institutions, but it's also the discipline of art history. Modern and contemporary African art is one of the more vigorous subfields within art history, at least in the United States. You only need to look at hirings and so forth. And these are also institutions that didn't bother for years to hire tenure track lines in the field. So it's not just for museums, but it's also art history and visual culture programs in the West. Salah, let's get to the the third phase or segment of this for short of time, which is what I had referred to as your track record of building institutions. And I can name several of them. You did mention the Forum for African Art, which basically brought major shows to the Venice Biennial of African artists. Prior to that moment, there was only one time that you had an exhibition of African artists at the Venice Biennial, which was in 1990, right? And so the Forum for African Art made it possible for Venice to even begin to now talk about pavilions, African pavilions. And later on, more African states started establishing their own national pavilions in Venice. I think that that's quite connected to this initiative of the Forum for African Arts. Iftikhar had mentioned earlier your work as a founding director of the Institute of Comparative Modernities at Cornell. And you have been very much involved as a principal investigator with Iftikhar on the Getty Connecting Art Histories initiative. And most recently, and for me, most significantly, is your work presently as the director of the Africa Institute in Sharjah. Given that we've sort of touched on these other projects, I want for us to end in terms of your present project, which I think is the most phenomenal in every sense. So if you could talk a little bit about the Africa Institute in Sharjah. What is this about and why Sharjah? I think I know the answer to that, but let me hear it from you. Why Sharjah and the Africa Institute?
I just want to add something and then I'll get to the Africa Institute. One thing is that we must, I think you mentioned, is that there was in the 90s a show, because that's just to be correct about the history of the African interventions in Venice. There was a show, there was traveling shows that actually initiated somewhere, not necessarily curated for the Venice Biennial. There was Grace Stanislaw's show.
Yes.
At the Studio Museum that traveled. I forgot the title, but it's important to recognize this. There was an effort to bring in African artists there prior to us, but ours is distinguished by the fact that it was a pavilion, it was institutionalized, and there was a hope for it. Of course, after that, several factors led, but then at the time really become not necessary because the narrative expanded. Okwe and other curators become much more open as a result of that show and many other interventions to the idea of including African artists. I think Iftikhar, I must say one thing, that Connecting Art Histories initiative is really Iftikhar's initiative. We just became in the Institute of Institute of Comparative Modernities as incubator for it in collaboration with the Asia Archive and the Dhaka Summit. So Iftikhar could talk about that, but let me just focus on I think Iftikhar talked a lot about my role within art history and also the Africana. And I can say a few words after that, but let me answer directly why the Africa Institute, why Sharjah? When I'm asked that, and I think you know the answer, is that why not Sharjah? Because if Ithaca, a small town in upstate New York or Northwestern in the suburbs of Chicago could have one of the oldest African studies, why not? And why the SOAS and not Sharjah? I think location-wise, it makes even more sense. It's closer to Africa, and it's also really at the interesting intersections of how the Sharjah is very well positioned in terms of the linkages as part of the Gulf to the Indian Ocean circulation, to East Africa, but it's also through the Red Sea. One of the things that also is people don't or forget, and I know you know that, I'm just saying in general, is that half of the Arab world are actually in Africa. So when you really think about Egypt, a part of Sudan or Tunisia and others, consider, so these kind of interesting geographies are of course complex, but also tied to the whole colonial legacy, but it's also specifically within African studies. But there is a history to this. In 1976, the ruler of Sharjah, Sheikh Sultan Muhammad Qasimi, who was a scholar in his own right, actually invited 3 Sudanese scholars to organize a conference in Sharjah in 1976 under the banner of Afro-Arab relations. That conference, we are actually trying to highlight it within the Institute, is that it has many of these major scholars that you can think about now today, became big scholars in the field, Nigerians, South Africans, Ali Mazrui among them. And then from the Arab side, there's Clovis Maqsood, there was Hisham Sharabi, amazing. And it was actually a very frank debate that touched on many, many sensitive subjects on the relationship between the Arab world and Africa, including slavery and migration and all of this. But it's also interesting is the kind of linkages that conference brought. But it's also, I will end with this, is that it is one of the recommendations of that conference is to establish this in 1976. Fast forward almost 40 years or so after this is established. Of course, people could go to the website and learn more, but it's a postgraduate studies, it's a think tank, but it's also you know, an archival place, and we'll have a library and other things. So there is all this aspect to it. It's really the major goal, and Africa here is viewed globally. So it's actually also diasporic, as we thought about in CAA and others. This institute will be that way. It's a ground, we thought it was a ground for really transcending all the problems with African studies in the West and really creating a new type of African studies that view Africa as dynamic, as global, as a global presence. So, but also have its own focus, like the Indian Ocean, linkages between the Arab world and Africa, Black intellectual tradition or African intellectual tradition in the context of trying to distinguish ourselves from other institutions like SOAS or other African studies in the West.
Fascinating. I very much look forward to the work of the Africa Institute and all these initiatives that you mentioned. Sadly, we've pretty much run out of time. I wish we had 10 hours to do this, but we don't. So let me give you a minute or two, Salah, for any final comments you would like to make.
Yeah, I think I must begin by thanking the CAA and all the members of the selection committee who, you know, bestowed this honor on me of the Distinguished Scholar for 2001. I thank them, and it's of course a great honor, but it's also a heavy burden for me, as would say, to represent. So hopefully this translates into an encouragement and a positive energy to do more. I'm also grateful to you guys, Elizabeth, Chika, and Iftikhar, for agreeing to be part of this panel and celebration of my career. You are among many, many friends that we share the journey in an effort actually to decenter and shift the paradigms of art history and repositioning the global South or African diaspora art history at the center of the discourses of our discipline. So I'm grateful to you and to many colleagues. There are so many people to thank in this journey. I think it was a journey of solidarity.